All right, Bernie. We left off yesterday with your first operation with 1-7, and then of course you joined Echo 2-1. Now, was Echo Company using M14s or M16s in this time in the early summer of '67?
The frontline companies platoons were being just switched over to M16s, and so the platoons and squads had them. But if you were an attachment like I was, or if you not an attachment, but if you weren't frontline combat grunt, then you were still packing a 14. And that were people like that went along with operations, communications guys, helicopter support teams. They all had M14s. Uh, there were certain companies that wanted to hang on to their M14. So there was initially in June, there was kind of a mixture as people were turning over, but still going on patrols and snooping and pooping with their M14 because they weren't issued them by then. But by the end of June, every company that I went with had M16s. That there were still a few 14s with people like me, uh, but I was able to make that switch in early June when I acquired and rescued a 45.
Now, what was your first encounter with the M16? What was your impression of it like?
Well, I got called in out of the field because we all had to come in and we all had to qualify with the M16. Uh, I I was surprised at how lightweight it was, and the rounds were, of course, smaller than the 7.62 that we had for the 14s. And I initially was, pleased to see that it was lightweight, but I didn't understand the importance of the smaller round. I thought, this is like looking at a World War II 30 M30 carbine round, which wasn't, but it served its purpose. Uh, I thought it was going to be interesting. Not, I shouldn't say interesting. I thought it was going to be a good weapon, but then I didn't have that much time with it. They brought me in, they issued it, surveyed my old 14, and gave me a 16, sent me the rifle range, and gave me a half-hour instruction to the rest of us that were in the group, and told how to keep it clean and how to continue to clean it and what to be careful with. And so that was my experience.
Now, when you initially make the switch, of course, when did you finally come into contact with the 45? What led you to swap out the 16 for the 45?
Well, I had an opportunity to help medevac radiomen. And of course, the policy was at that time, you kept, when you medevac someone, you kept their weapons. You didn't send the weapon along with the medevac. And so, they often would give people like me who are an attachment, we had extra things to carry. They would give us extra rifles to carry, extra ammunition, whatever it was. That the medevac took only the wounded, not their gear, and so we had to hump their gear. And so that worked out for me that I just humped the gear. And when we came back out of the field, nobody asked for it, so I just kept it.
Now, how much ammo would you carry for the 45 on yourself?
Well, I think others will tell you that with a 45, you didn't put in all 9 rounds because that would screw up your magazine. It just didn't. So you carried a clip with 7 rounds. That seemed to be the magic number that it didn't have to jam. So I would carry 7 rounds in the pistol, and then I would carry uh, four other clips with which would be 7 times 4. And that was and what I carried in my backpack and carried in one of the ammo belt pouch. So that was basically what I carried. I carried, with 7 rounds times 5 is, that's what I had.
Now, going out again, of course, the M16 is coming into play. You're also now carrying, of course, a 45. Did you notice Marines starting to make comments about the M16 in July and August? Were opinions changing on the rifle?
Yes, I heard, from guys that said, this, I don't like this piece of crap. I'm not comfortable with it. I need the heavy weight and the durability of the 14, my 14. It was mostly guys that had, been with the first rounds of coming in, and they were accustomed to having, served with their M14s for maybe 2 years or so, and they just had great confidence in that. And they weren't too sure because it was such a different switch, such a different design for a 16 than for a 14. The 14 looked more like a combat weapon. The 16 was, kind of shorter and lighter, and people weren't trusting it. So there were times, and I when I heard that so and so was unhappy with the 16 and they didn't want to carry it, but they had to carry it. And there was one incident that I remember where a couple of M16s jack uh, broke down, and the guys in the squad carrying them were saying they want their M14s back, but there was no chance of that. The decision had been made, and that was if you were in a company line, you carried your 16. There were still a couple 14s around, but they were for attachment type people.
Now for Echo Company, you went on the first operation. Well, when did they go out again, and where did you go off to next?
Well, we came back off of Calhoun, and about a week later, we were sent down to what we called Gono Island, and you probably heard that referenced many times. Well, Gono Island was in our TOR, and so they had been very active in the Gono Island was basically a VC R&R. We used to call it the VC R&R because the whole village, the whole area was basically a VC stronghold. And every time I went in there 3 times, and I named Operation Pike, Operation. It just ran through my mind. Uh, anyway, in July and August, we went there 3 times, and all 3 times we got our butts kicked. But we did do some damage, but you knew when you went to Gono, you were going to get into a fight. It was just a given. And so Pike and Shelbyville, that's the other one I'm trying to think of. Pike and Shelbyville were 2 operations that were carried out with 2-1 Echo primarily. And that would have been early. Well, I think I remember the 4th of July was when the Operation Pike set off, if I remember correctly. And so we would do at the first one, Pike, we went to Gono Island on Amtrak's to take us over. Of course, you had to ford a river to get over to Gono Island. And so they took us in Amtrak's, which were a scary situation because if there was any wave action at all, it was bouncy and you would slam around. And I vowed I wouldn't ride them again if I could avoid it. But we went in there, and I think we went across in daylight, and they pretty much took us on after we got on the island. And I think we stayed 3 or 4 days, or 4 days, make it worth 4 or 5 days. I'd have go back to the index of operations. But we came back out of there and after several days of nightly ambushes, nightly probes, daytime mortars occasionally. They had some mortars that they would drop on us. It was a tough place. It still is, I think. I don't think we're even to this day welcomed on Gono Island. Some people called it Cigar Island. I think the Army, once we were moved out of there, the Army went in. They got kind of bloodied up and had a great respect for not going there if they could avoid it. But anyway, those were 2 that I remember as Pike and Shelbyville. and both of them were going to Island, I remember. The second one we went in at night. I went with the initial platoon. We went in at night and forded the river, and carrying our all of our gears and hanging on to one another in case one of them fell down or hit a sump hole. So that was, we were in line, but you had your hand on the other guy's pack because you didn't know where there might be a sinkhole. But we got in there early in the morning and set up a blocking area because we anticipated that the other company, I can't remember, it might have been Gulf. They were going to push towards us at the end of going to Island. They were going to push them towards us, and so went in at night and set up positions on the bank, and anticipating it being, them being pushed towards us. I think I wrote it. I'd have to go through my books again, but I'm pretty sure I wrote a story or two on that one about the falling into the mine. I think I sent you that one about the kid that fell through the ground and uncovered a VC factory making armaments.
Yes, sir.
Maybe,
This one right here.
yeah. That
So,
that was that was the one that Echo Company 2 day. I say 2 day, but it might have been a little longer. South of Da Nang, which was going to Island, right? So
now,
that verifies, at least in my mind again, that it was going to Island that we went into.
so for this mine factory, what happened that day with this Marine in itself, and how did you go about gathering the story?
I was moving forward with one of the platoons, and we were coming up off the beach because we come in along and walk the beach line, which was kind of an area that I recall had some brush along the area, and so we were sweeping through that. And once we moved up off the beach and started sweeping towards the tree line, and got into the tree line, that's when the Marine suddenly fell into the hole, and there was great emphasis to find out what the word going on and to get him out of there as fast as they could. And once they got to him, he said, "Hey, there's a bunch of stuff down there. This is a tunnel, I think." And so that was how we found it. And they were manufacturing. The thing about the early days with Echo down in 221 area was we didn't really have the NBA attack us like they did the 5th Marines down Chulai. But what we did is we had a lot of booby traps. And so they were manufacturing booby trap, you know, taking all of our old, they would acquire some uh, hand grenades, our hand grenades. They'd put them in a sea ration can and then run the wire up along a gate or an opening somewhere where you could trip it. So there were a lot of booby traps that they were building. That's why I said the woman lived in a hut and she started digging up all kinds of grenades, powder, explosives, and items for the mines and booby traps. So that was how we uncovered. Kid just kind of fell through it, I guess, if I
Well,
remember correctly.
well, and it makes you wonder too, at least for me, how many other mine factories were never discovered in parts of Vietnam that were just underground?
I think south of us, where they had tunnels, there were a lot of mine 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 workshops. Uh, we had a good amount of booby trap kind of stuff that was intended to wound us, not necessarily kill us, but wound us and then cause us to have to hold up and get medevac and everything. So there was more of that. Occasionally, you'd find an NBA kind of mine. They had personnel mines. Uh, so there was plenty of what I would call workshops up in the Quang Tree, the northern area, and they would make them and then carry them back down to the south to Da Nang and south to Chulai. I think they had a resupply uh, point where they would, manufacture uh, booby traps, and then they would, send them out to uh, BC that were working different areas. Unlike now, we did not really engage that I recall. We never really engaged except on a few occasions, what you would call an NVL regular. Most of them were VC. Once we got up to Quang Tri, we saw only NVA. There were no more VC, and we were taking on a real organized army once we got up north. But down below, it was operations, and it was booby traps, and it was occasional sniping. That was my experience anyway.
Now, going out with Echo 2-1 and spending a lot of time with them, did the booby traps and the scattered contact impact the morale of Echo Company?
No, I don't think it affected the morale. It kind of gave them, you know, uh, kind of a short temper for the local VCs, villages, and huts that we went through. They were we were very, very intent on questioning everybody and searching around their area to see if they had any kind of things that might be used to build traps. So after a while, you come through this village every 5 days or every 6 days, and you're still looking at booby traps that are being put out. And the last time you cleaned them up, you come back 5 6 days later, there's more of them. So I wouldn't say it got their ire up. I would say that it was just they were everybody was angry that you couldn't get a good shot at anybody because we just didn't run into them. They weren't organized enough in that area. Once
Right.
we had some areas, I mean, by the time we were doing operations in August and September, we were starting to get much heavier fighting. We actually got into the NV, the local VC were the ones that lived around the Ville and probably make a small line, but the BC battalions and companies, they started getting active around August and September in our area, and we started having regular stand your ground fights with them.
Now, I've asked a lot of Marines this, especially from 5th Marines who spent a lot of time fighting Viet Cong and then, of course, NVA, depending on the situation of the war. Did you have an opinion on the Viet Cong and the difference between the NVA?
Yes, I do, and I've never really been too cautious to not give my opinion. Uh, in the parlance of Marines, I would sit down and have a beer with an NVA soldier and talk about old times. But I want nothing to do with VC. I do not want to shake their hand. I do not want to have a beer with them. And I still hold them, in my opinion, they were in the position of being terrorists, what we would call terrorists. They would be the villages that were they would come in and take the food. They take the kids to carry the ammunition. They were just I well, I've got a couple memories of just how brutal the VC were, and so to this day, I understand the whole. I've read commentary by BC battalions and BC officers, and uh, they. I still do have an animosity, I guess you might call it, about against the VC because I don't really equate them as being a, a, a suitable foe. We were battling terrorists, in my opinion.
Give me 1 second, Bernie. Hold on. I'll be back in a second.
Sure.
Now, Bernie, if I may ask, if you're comfortable, what is your what were some of the brutality that you remember from the Viet Cong, if you recall?
Yeah, enslavement. They would come into a village and they would take the youngest children, the ones that weren't draft age, and they'd have them haul gear up into the mountains and keep them there as basically pack mules. Other times they would come down and they'd take all the food out of the bill and tell them that they were needed for a higher cause. I personally saw some village elder heads on a pike or on a bamboo pole, and the story we were told that they had assassinated them because the village was what we might call a government building, and so I did not. That was not a welcome sight. Some of the brutality that they would inflict on members of the village that was probably a government village. They were always careful to terrorize them and take some captives. Uh, I those were the incidences I remember. Uh, if I can give you a comparison, and that was, it's been discovered, of course, that during the time they occupied Way, they marched thousands of educators, professionals. We know on that they marched thousands of people in up out of the city, and then they discovered an assassination and mass grave of hundreds of them were uncovered. And later, the research showed that it was not the NBA that did that. The NBA were military, and the program of taking people and shooting them and burying them in mass graves were all done by the VC. And so that was an example, and it's verified. It's been written in several reports, and it's been verified. But that was the VC. Well, the VC, the NBA leaders knew that the VC were political terrorists, whereas the NBA was an army fighting for their cause. So the result was the VC the VC I do not hold well. They were not uh, an honorable enemy in my opinion.
Well, and being that you saw this, and I know that you heard or at least saw ARVN forces with your time in country, did the ARVN ever retaliate against the Viet Cong in the South with any of the same brutality to try to send a message?
Well, they would, yeah, they drowned people up and put them into a little in a little guarded fence. They drowned people up that they suspected as having some tie to the Viet Cong. And so they would round them up, bring the bills in, surround the bill, and then the ARVN others, they just turn them back to the village. I don't remember any. I never saw any what I'd call atrocities, or I never saw any brutalizing of the civilians, unless there was cause for them, to like. No, I go back, and I'm sorry, I'm stuttering here, but what I meant to say was uh, the we would cordon off a village, and then the ARVN would come in and go through the village, verifying who's there and who wasn't there, and verifying that what their positions were. Were they farmers, or were they merchants, or what? Uh, and so that would come through, and you'd put them into a guarded area, and then the South Vietnamese would come through and do the investigation. we didn't hold any one particular person or any group that I'm aware of. I never saw anybody uh, brutalizing a group, really. I mean, there
Now,
was some anger.
now with that, seeing and working with the Arvin and working with the locals, did you ever write any stories about Arvin actions or working with local Vietnamese in the villages?
No, I don't remember writing any. There were several stories about the corpsmen, and when they go out and do what they call civil action, they go up and set up a clinic when they bring in the Vietnamese, and look at if they had wounds or if they had dental problems, or they were called med caps, medical platoons, I guess. I can't remember. Med caps. I never wrote a story on them. I saw them. I know that a couple of my fellow correspondents wrote several stories on med caps because they were good. They were a good PR story. They liked, the headquarters liked having those.
Well, and speaking of stories, I wanted to go back to what we were looking at of the mine factory. And I've got several sea tigers. I've probably got over 40, and I've never noticed this before, but you've got two stories that are side by side in this
Yeah.
exact article here. So what was the school memorial associated with? What happened there?
Well, that was another what we call headquarters called a good story is the school, the village or the area where we were at. They had a classroom, but it was an open air classroom subject to noise, and teaching was very difficult. And we had of course an engineer battalion that was attached to us, and they looked at it and saw all these kids were sitting out there in the sun or sitting underneath a tin roof, and that wasn't trying to go to school. And so the engineering battalion took it on as a public, or as a what they call public affairs issue. And so they went ahead and got the authorization, brought in contractors, and actually built a very nice school for the kids. And it was a great story. It was a well attended. When they had the dedication, they brought in several of our brass to witness of it all. But it was a very good project, and it served well. And there was a lot of pride in that. And it was a cooperation. Worked with both the South Vietnamese army and South Vietnamese people were hired to work on buildings. So it was a great front piece that showed that we Marines, or we were not just avoiding looking for gunfights. We actually were trying to help the lives of the people. That was the PR part of it. That's why the North Vietnamese, when they came to defining what we were, they called us that we were basically the propagandists. They considered us propagandists, you know. And so when we were propagandists, to tell you the truth, there was a lot of truth. There was That was probably the secondary mission. Primary mission was to get some kind of, you know, press information out on individuals. But anyway, yeah, we were propagandists.
Well, and to echo off that propagandist aspect, you're the first correspondent or photographer to mention it. Do you think that there would have been a bounty or anything on your heads if you would have been captured as correspondents or photographers? Anything that would have been, confidential, that you would have to worry about being taken prisoner?
Uh, no, not really. We heard the rumor that there was a price on our head, but there was a price on the corpsman. There was a price on the radio guy. There were all kinds of rumors that they had money would be paid off if they got one of us. Uh, the thing that we were never really considered. The NVA, of course, had what they called they were the local educator. They were I'm trying to remember how to call them. They had this group of people in each regiment that were responsible for uh, going out and making sure that the news media that they got was contrary to what we were doing. And I guess I've gotten off the subject. Uh, take me back again, Zach. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay, Bernie. It's just if you would have been taken a prisoner as a correspondent, is there was there a protocol put in place if you were to be taken prisoner with any of the stories you had written down? What was the process there?
It really wasn't that I know. I don't recall. Um, I can tell you that during the Tet Offensive, I had I knew both the acting OIC of the AFBN radio station in a way, and one of the sergeants there was my friend Tom, and we had been working at El Toro together. And when they came and they surrounded the radio station, because that was one of the big objectives of the invasion, was to get the AFBN station down. Tom was wounded and later assassinated, but he and another Corporal Deering Corporal Deering and Lieutenant DiBernardo were captured, and they marched them all the way up to POWs in Hanoi, and that's where he was, and both of them were there, and they were, and after DiBernardo was released and finally came home after several years. He said that they treated him as if he was some kind of a propagandist again. And so his lot in the POW camp was, he was supposed to get people to make these video condemning the American action. And of course, he said there was nothing I could do. He said if I wanted to continue to live, I had to do what they wanted. So he was forced in some cases to tape these so-called confessions of Americans that they had captive. But there was not there was no wasn't no, not a particular ransom for him or for Deering or for Sergeant Deering.
Well, and I definitely want to go back to the Armed Forces Radio when we get to your time in Way City because of the connection you had there. But I also wanted to bring up this other story that you've shared with me, and that all the stories you wrote about were just about line Marines, riflemen, grunts. You've got one here about a cook. So what happened here?
Well, the cook he was a cook, and he was in his uh, the company got in trouble, and they started getting over wounded and getting pinned down, and they needed help, and so the Bobby Lenore, Sergeant Bobby Lenore, and a couple other guys jumped on a truck that was going to take supplies and take more troops in to try and get the company or the platoons out of trouble. And of course, he was responsible for running up and grabbing, literally carrying back 4 different guys
Wow.
wounded. And that was, you wouldn't assume that a mess sergeant had any kind of a combat record, but he just showed. I still like to point that story as being the story of every Marine is a rifleman. That's part of the mantra of the Marine Corps is every man's a rifleman. Well, here's a cook who volunteered and carried ammunition and carried out wounded, whose job is normally to sit and prepare food. But when the call came, he went right away, and distinguished himself very well.
Well, and like you and I talked yesterday with Marine Corps giving out awards, this is not something that's given out often when it comes to Valor Awards. Can you elaborate on that with your experience?
Well, there's all kinds of stories. We used to say the Army would line them up as they were going home and to give every man a Bronze Star just because they were there. Yeah, that was one of the ones that we would love to tell. There's no disagreement, and I think even your senior brass will tell you that the Marine Corps is very tight-assed about giving out medals because they require extensive documentation and witnessing and everything. So you don't get a Bronze Star or a Silver Star without somebody deciding you did something of valor. Uh, so again, this story to me, sitting here all these years later, and I remember thinking about it when I wrote it, was here's a good story that talks about a Marine being a rifleman again. Just part of our mantra was every Marine's a rifleman. Well, we saw that in the first reaction company sent up to Way City. They went through the whole grab, and they grabbed people that were radio men. I remember distinctly finding one guy who was with me on Hotel 25, and I asked him, I said, well, what unit are you with? And he said, I don't know, I'm an accountant, and they came and got me 2 days ago and put me on this truck. He said, now I'm in the middle of the battle. He said, I'm shooting and swooping and running. And he said, I don't know how I got here. They just came through and said they were putting together a reactionary company and threw me in the truck. Nobody knew where I was going. He 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 just kept doing what he was supposed to do, keep moving around, carrying his weapon. I never saw him again. That was just a passing conversation. But it's documented just how short-handed we were at the initial dates of when Way City broke out. They were grabbing every piece of equipment and every available guys. There was guys waiting. The only people that they didn't take were if you could show that you were on a draft to go home. But if you were just coming off R&R, didn't make any difference where you were supposed to go back to your company. They put you on the reactionary truck and away you went.
Well, and it's like I know with the time you spent in Way City, I think we're going to have multiple sessions talking about the day-to-day activity in Way, and I'm looking forward to that. But it's like a lot of people don't understand the fighting and the intensity in Way City. I know Alpha 1-1 gets ambushed across the Anku Bridge and pinned down, and they lose their skipper that's wounded. The gunnery sergeant takes over, and Alpha Company had 2 Medal of Honor recipients, not counting the Navy Cross and Silver Stars there. And then we'll get to that eventually. But you're right, every man's a rifleman. Every man does their job, and then when it comes down to it, Marines do more than their job, even if it's not part of what the requirement is.
Yeah, it's ingrained from the first day you stand in the yellow footprints in boot camp, and you learn the fact that there is a lure lore the word skips me at the moment, but it's a mantra. You're by the time you finish the training, you realize that you're part of something really big, and you have a responsibility to remain to that reputation, keep building on that history, so to speak.
Well, even still today, it's like a good friend of mine who served in the Marines. His generation of heroes wasn't the World War II Marines. It was you. It was the Vietnam Marines that set the standard for him. And, you still set the standard today for a lot of the Marine Corps history, for a lot of the Marines that join, is that their grandfathers, their neighbors were Vietnam veterans.
Oh, it happens. Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely 100%. It's why do you want to be in the Marine Corps? Well, because my dad or my uncle or my brother was in the Marine Corps. Well, what do you think the Marine Corps is? Well, it's just a good unit. It's a bunch of butt guys. Uh, but it's yeah. I'm
It's
sorry.
No,
Lost
don't apologize. It's just the legacy and the standard that's created. And with that, in many ways, you have a further legacy with the stories that we've talked about, like this one. Here you've got another story about a corpsman ends up in Sea Tiger. And so Echo 2-1 again, because of course this is July, August, you're spending time with them. But what happened here with the doc?
Doc. Well, as far as I know, he was moved back to battalion. Uh, after having done his tracheotomy, he went back. He was on the chopper, still tending to the Marine, and he, instead of coming back to the company, they moved him up to the battalion uh, because of his expertise. Then part of it was is they decided that he had enough experience in the field that they could put him in battalion. So he was moved up to there. I never saw him out again because battalion didn't send very many corpsmen because every company had several corpsmen, every platoon had several corpsmen. But yeah, Norman Miller, yeah, that was quite an event.
Well, being that you were out there, how did he perform the trache? I can't say the word myself. Word escaped me.
Tracheotomy.
Tracheotomy. Tracheotomy. Thank you.
Tracheotomy.
So how
Now
did he do
you help me with some words. I'll help you.
it? So how did he do it? Did he have the proper tools or did he have to improvise in the field?
Well, they had a tracheotomy kit. Each corpsman carried a tracheotomy kit, and but it was they were trained on it in school, but this was the first time he'd ever done it, and he just used it. I asked him. I said, you know, did you train on these? He said, you training and everything. He said, but you better, this you're just flying by your ass. And he said, that's all I did. And I was with him, and when they called forward for a corpsman, and Miller went up there, and then I followed him back up, find out what was going on. By that time, they had the wounded guy kind of laying on a poncho, uh, and kicking. It was hard. He was having a hard time. He would have died. And Miller just opened up his kit, grabbed this tracheotomy thing, and I was standing back with several other Marines waiting for the helicopter to come in. And he had this tube. The tricky thing is to not cut the vocal cord, but he was enough to he was enough to get the tracheotomy kit into the breathing aspect. And so it was a surgical knife, counting down the neck, finding out where he was supposed to put the knife, and then it was just a matter of making the cut and inserting the breathing tube. That's how I remember it.
Well, and the fact that it was done in the field,
Yeah, it
is
was right out. It was right out there in the DMZ of the Da Nang area.
wow. Now, being that, of course, you're a Marine combat veteran, how are corpsmen viewed by Marines? I mean, they're naval trained, but how are the docs viewed once they get put out there in the platoons and the companies?
There's an incredible and never um, there's an incredible relationship between corpsmen, their doc, and Marines. It's a simpatical kind of situation where they are held in a whole different light. They're greatly respected. They're greatly honored. Marines realize that corpsman is capable of saving their life, and so that makes them a bond that's unprecedented. I have several corpsman friends that I spent time in the field with, uh, and I would every corpsman I ever saw was heroic when it came to corpsman up. When somebody called for a corpsman, there wasn't a hesitation, and if you knew that if you were wounded, that corpsman would come for you, and so you had tremendous respect and support for your doc. I can you can listen to the wounded laying out there, and what they're yelling is doc, doc. That other thing they're yelling is mom, mom. You know, and so it's a great matter of respect. One of the strongest that I know of for another form.
Well,
Greatly.
and in many ways too, it takes something beyond courage to run into gunfire, not to fight, but to rescue and save those that are hit. I mean, it's something you can't put into words.
Yeah, it's the legend of the corpsman, what they call the FMF corpsman, and those are the ones that are selected and trained to be with Marines instead of on a battalion hospital ship or somewhere. But those Fleet Marine corpsmen are some of the bravest and strongest that you can read Marine history, and you'll always find the symbiotic tie between the corpsman and the Marine.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I love about the relationship between Marines and their corpsmen in the field is that it's an unbreakable bond where with all the Marines I've ever talked to is that the corpsmen, they're not Navy men out there. They're Marines. They're just like everybody else. They just save you.
Yep. And that they are Marines. They're fully absolutely integrated as Marines. And the other thing is, interestingly enough, Zach, now that you mention it, is I've talked with a couple of corpsmen who spent most of their time in the corpsman field, and the ones that were assigned and worked with Marines, fleet FMF Marine corpsmen, when they went back to the hospital ships or went back to the hospitals and ended their term with the FMF, they weren't widely received by the rest of the corpsmen because certain degree of a certain degree of envy, I think. But they had a hard time integrating because people didn't want the FMF because they figured that they were much more undisciplined because they'd been with Marines. Doc Turner told me that years ago. He said,
Wow.
he said, when I came home, he said, I got reassigned after, my 18 months with FMF. He said, they sent me to the hospital ship down or to a hospital in Corpus Christi. And he said, there was a certain stigma attached to being an FMF corpsman because you thought you were, they thought you thought they were better than they were. But they said no, it was because they thought we were undisciplined and we had a hard time adjusting. Well, I said, so did every Vietnam vet that I know had a hard time. But anyway, that was just an observation. Is that
Well,
when they went back out of being with Marines, they had to, as Doc said, they had to de-marine us. We had to go through therapy to get out of the Corps.
well, and I've got some interviews I'm going to hopefully get to in the future with some corpsmen that were with Alpha 1-1 or with 2-5. And so I'd love to bring in that perspective. But real quick, before we take our quick little break, I wanted to bring up a photograph that I know you'll appreciate. And I wanted to just get a little context here. So what are we looking at in this photograph here, Bernie?
Well, we're looking at myself and my photographer, Mike MJ Coates, and I worked together in many operations down in the Da Nang TOR area. And we were just coming back off a sweep as I think I explained yesterday, when you had a battalion headquarters or a compound for a battalion, you always had platoons out there sweeping to make sure nobody was coming up behind you. And so Mike and I would go out on a couple of these sweeps, and as you can tell, no flak jacket, no helmets. That was how we traveled down south. And this was probably taken in July or August. Mike and I, we worked together the whole time I was with 2-1. He mostly went with 2-1. He and another, the photographers worked as a team. There was a still photographer, and then there was a motion pic Mopic guy. And so one of the guys we worked with should have been in the picture, but he wasn't. I think he was just left for go eat or something. But that was the two of us. Like I said, we worked together all the way up to October when after Operation Medina went back, they decided that they were going to put together another another battalion landing force. And so they sent Mike and sent MJ and the two motion picture guys, sent them off to go on this float deal. And so that was in October. But we worked together. I think I still have a picture somewhere. Have to get it out, I guess.